What's going on, everybody? Good morning. Hope you guys are doing well. And it's that time of year again. This has become an annual tradition for the Seattle Seahawks. John Boyle writes a really fun article in the weeks following the NFL draft, taking us inside the Seattle Seahawks war room and basically running us through their decision making and their thinking as the draft went on. And I've made videos talking about this article each year. I'm not going to go through the whole thing on video here, but there is a lot of good stuff here, and I do want to go through some of it. I think some of this stuff is pretty illuminating, and some of it does indicate their thinking and how they were approaching this draft, and it sheds some light on stuff. So if you haven't read the article yet, definitely get on over to Seahawks.com and check it out. This video is sponsored by PrizePicks. So let's go ahead and start scrolling through the actual article. And it's a pretty long article. I may even end up splitting this into two videos. I don't know yet. But the early part of it was just talking about how he doesn't know if they're going to pick in the first round or not. They do eventually decide on Jadarian Price, of course, and I'll get into some of the things said there later. But yeah, so the draft starts here. This is like 10 minutes before the draft starts. Calls everyone in to express gratitude for the work they've done to get the team ready. Uses the phrase loose and focused, which is one of McDonald's favorite phrases. And then things fast forward to almost 2.5 hours later, where we are now into the 20s. And the Seahawks are now starting to really think about things. Are they going to pick? Are they going to trade? There's a sentence here detailing how there was a general sense there was not a surefire blue chip player. There were not a lot of surefire blue chip players in this draft. And at this point, after Malachi Lawrence goes, with 10 picks left to go in the first round, the Seahawks only have a couple of players left on their board with first round grades, and a couple more that are right on the line of being late first or early second. Now, the article does not, to my knowledge, ever specify if they viewed Jadarian Price as being a first rounder. But it does seem like they at least had him in this latter group with the late first, early second guys. So I'm not sure if they actually did have a first round grade on him, but I get the sense that he was in this group based on what I'm reading here. But that is consistent with what a lot of people, myself included, felt about this draft. It was not great. There's this one part here about how there was a little bit of an issue with the music that was being played in the war room during draft day. But then you get to some notable insight here with what some of the other NFL teams are doing. So this paragraph right here, somewhere in the 20s, we're not going to tell you where a player is selected that was not particularly high on Seattle's board, something the personnel department refers to as an upset. So somewhere in the 20s, there was a player taken that the team was not imagining would go that high. Now, there was also this at the end of this segment where he mentions that at least one defensive player the Seahawks liked went off the board late in round one, drawing a reaction from the room. Now, if you go to the first round here, if you take a look at that area of the draft, the 20s, I think it's fairly, at least, clear. I would say it's fairly clear that the player they were surprised by going that early was Keelan Rutledge, and the player that they were disappointed by going ahead of them was Chris Johnson. That would at least be my best guess. If you like sports, then the best way to make them even better and more exciting is using the PrizePicks app, where it always feels good to be right. PrizePicks makes daily fantasy simple. Just pick more or less on your favorite players and build lineups with a few taps. Whatever sport you're into, and obviously we are now firmly into the NFL offseason, so we're all about baseball. We got some basketball, we got some hockey, whatever it is you like. PrizePicks gives you a fun way to stay locked in while you're watching. Definitely make sure to use the promo code HMA. PrizePicks is hooking up users with $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. If you use that promo code, that is HMA. I've had a great time on PrizePicks so far, so definitely get on over to it, check it out, and make sure to get your lineups. And don't forget about team picks, where you can pick winners, spreads, and totals on any major game. So Download the app now, use HMA, and get on over to Prize Picks, where it always feels good to be right. And remember, always gamble responsibly. Based on the way the article is worded, it has to be a defensive player. Late in round 1, the options, if that is the criteria, would be Mesidor, Lawrence, Thieneman, Johnson, Peter Woods, and Keldrick Falk. And maybe it could be Falk. Maybe, I guess, it could be Malachi Lawrence. I don't know. But I think it's pretty clearly Chris Johnson. And the player that they were surprised went so early, again, you could talk me into it being Concepcion. Maybe it's Peter Woods, I guess, or Omar Cooper, but I think it's Rutledge. That might be me projecting, but I don't think most people thought Rutledge was going to be a first-round pick. I think he was a late second-rounder at best for most people, so I think that's probably the two things mentioned in this article, but we will not be knowing for sure. Now, there's this one really interesting paragraph here, and a few people have called this out. It seems to have nothing to do with anything. McDonald walks to the back of the room and starts studying the wall that has the current roster of every NFL team. McDonald pauses at the New York Giants roster and looks at the group of edge defenders. And he shakes his head, marveling at New York's collection of edge rushers. That's a little bit of a weird thing to say. It's a weird thing to call out. It seems so non sequitur, but maybe it's not. Maybe this indicates, maybe this is trying to be like a Marvel after credit scene or something. Because we all talk about Kayvon Thibodeau, but there's actually more going on in that room than just Kayvon Thibodeau. Brian Burns, for all we know, the Giants are willing to move him because they view him as being something that won't be there in its current form by the time they're ready to be good again. Remember, they did hire a new coach this offseason. That new coach may not look at these players the same way the previous regime did. Abdul Carter, same thing. Abdul Carter, even though I seriously doubt the Giants would ever move him, it's not impossible to imagine that Harbaugh doesn't see it with him the way that the previous regime did. And of course, they added Arvell Reese. Now, obviously, they're not going to trade him. They just got him. But the point is, clearly, this is meaningful. McDonald seems to have seen something in this group that he really likes. And maybe this is indicative of him trying to indicate that he wants to make a play for one of these guys. And Thibodeau's the obvious one that we talk about. But don't rule out Brian Burns either. And I would like that a lot better because I view Brian Burns as actually being a complete player. But anyway, so we get the Keelan Rutledge pick. We get the Chris Johnson pick. And it's mentioned that there are a bunch of trades happening in front of Seattle. And the more trades that happen in front of Seattle, the harder it is for Seattle to actually make a trade. Because the teams that want to move up are dealing with other teams. And they mention how Schneider did want to trade back. And he is talking to other teams about it. And the compensation just isn't enough. And this, combined with some other things said in this article, kind of indicates that in this draft in particular, but most drafts recently, trade back offers are not getting you the value that they used to. And rather than force it like he's done before, Schneider has adapted by saying, I'm just not going to do it unless I get a real offer. So, yeah, New England selects Lomu, Chiefs take Woods, Seattle continues to take phone calls. Another trade, the Jets coming up to take Omar Cooper, and then the Titans take Keldrick Falk. Basically, the fact that there were so many trades right before the Seahawks picked took the wind out of their sails of trading themselves. And you get to the Jadarian Price pick that they end up making, and it's pretty clear that they viewed him as fitting a need, which he obviously did. And I'd also throw in, he does a pretty good job fitting the scheme, the outside zone running. And they also had him standing out at the top of players remaining on the board. And that's one thing that I want to say here. According to most things that I've heard, and some of the things I've heard are not just random rumor, there are things that I've heard that are, I think, at least fairly credible. The Seahawks did view Jadarian Price as being one of the best, maybe even the best player available at their pick. Now, I don't know if I 100% believe that, and I know I don't agree with it, but at the same time, if that is true, let's just say for the sake of argument that is true, there's not a ton I can say about that, right? Like, we want the Seahawks to take BPA, but we also have to acknowledge we're not always going to agree on what BPA is. So if the team genuinely thought that Price was one of the best or maybe even the best player available at their pick, then I got to roll with that. Like, this is not, there have been years in the past, distant past at this point, but in the past where this team has, I think, very clearly, and they would even admit to drafting for need. And what they're trying to tell us here is that they did not draft for need. Now, I don't agree with the assessment that Price was one of the best players available at 32, but if they came to a different conclusion, then I don't think it's completely out of bounds. So I understand, right? This is the trade-off you make. You want your team to draft by BPA, but you also have to accept that, especially late in the draft, you're not always going to agree what BPA is, and you got to live with that. So they draft Price, they detail that phone call a little bit here, and then you have the pick actually getting announced on the broadcast, and that gets you to the end of day one. And it's clear that, at the very least, based on their rhetoric, they really liked Price, and they seem to think that he's special. Now, whether or not that's just after the fact, trying to gird the pick a little bit, who knows? But they're trying to convince us that they really thought he was that good. And again, as a fan of a team, that's something you have to live with. Even when your team starts drafting the right way, which is BPA and chasing value, you're not always going to have the same opinion of what value and BPA is. And sometimes it's so far beyond the pale that there's no case to be made. Like, I don't think there was a case to be made that Dwayne Eskridge was the best player available or close when we picked him in 2021, but Price is not that egregious. All right, so then we fast forward to the middle point of day two, 5:38 p.m. So this is after the Patriots take Akas, or I think it's pronounced Akas. Some people have said it's not Yakas, it's Akas. 55th overall, so the Seahawks are going to be up in 8 picks. They continue to think about moving back. They have a couple of players left with second-round grades. One of them is Bud Clark. So they viewed him as being a player worthy of being a second-round pick. They also had a pass rusher, and it's implied those are the only 2 players left they had a second-round grade on. And let's see, there's another phone call here talking about trade stuff. Jacksonville takes Bo Kircher. Eagles trade for Grenard, which was something that the team wanted to know about because that changes what other teams are going to do. Although it is kind of implied that the Seahawks were not interested in trading for Grenard, which is notable because that was something that we talked about a little bit and seemed a little bit interesting. More trade talk, Logan Jones. Here's an interesting part. The Seahawks are relieved that the Browns take Emmanuel McNeil-Warren. They liked McNeil-Warren well enough, but it seems like they were worried the Browns would take Bud Clark, which means they liked Bud Clark more than EMW. And I think the reason why that is, because I do think EMW's a better overall player, is because EMW doesn't necessarily fit McDonald's defense as a safety, because he's more of a box safety. EMW, I think, is more of like a Cam Chancellor type, maybe. And Bud Clark is somebody that is a little bit more ubiquitous, and I think that's what McDonald wants. Shortly after that pick is in, Schneider announces that one potential trade back was no longer on the table. This is an interesting paragraph when the Titans take Anthony Hill. It's noted in the room that by the trade chart the Seahawks used, the Titans won that trade. That's keeping with a theme that has come up a few times, which is that the teams moving up tend to be getting pretty good value by Seattle's chart. So this is Seattle's chart, not a ubiquitous, everybody uses it chart. So the implication is that trading back just doesn't get you what you need. Rams take Claire at 61. Schneider takes another call, and he says we're getting our ass kicked, which is basically meaning we're not getting good offers on trading back. So the implication is we're just going to pick here unless somebody really ponies up with the offer. So they get to 64. They take Bud Clark, and clearly this is a player that the team believes is worthy of being that second-round pick. They do allude to Kirchner missing out on a guy that he really wanted to draft in the second round, but they give no indication of who it was. So really hard to speculate on that. But they do get Bud Clark, which is something that the team is excited about, and I buy it. All right. So that gets us to round 3. I'm going to go ahead and cut the video here and upload a little bit later with the second half of this. But great article. Definitely read it if you get the chance. Go Hawks. I just don't want a video to be 30 minutes long if I can help it. See you guys later.